This is Jimmy McGill, a man who wanted nothing more than to be good, to be loved, to be respected. But somewhere along the way, that dream rotted, and what was left was Saul Goodman, a man who could talk his way out of anything except himself. So, how does a man go from hero to hustler, from brother to betrayer, from savior to scam artist? This isn't just the story of Saul Goodman. This is the anatomy of a moral collapse and the terrifying truth that it could happen to any one of us. Before he was Saul Goodman, before the sleazy commercials, the shady clients, the whispered deals, Jimmy McGill was just a man in a cheap shirt who believed he was meant for more. He wasn't a genius, he wasn't born into power, but Jimmy had something else, something dangerous, a refusal to be ordinary. That hunger came with a cost. Even before he stepped into a courtroom, Jimmy was bending rules like a sculptor bends clay, not because he loved crime, but because rules were in his way. And when rules got in the way, Jimmy broke them. It's easy to forget that Jimmy started out with good intentions. He worked in his brother Chuck's law firm mailroom, dreaming of earning respect the hard way. But to Chuck, Jimmy's ambition wasn't inspiring, it was threatening. He saw him not as a lawyer in the making, but a con artist pretending to wear a suit. And here's the tragedy. When someone tells you often enough that you're less than them, you start to believe it. Or worse, you decide to prove them right. Jimmy McGill was about to step into the world of law, but instead of justice, he would find temptation. The opposite narrative is present in the prequel series to Breaking Bad. Better Call Saul focuses on lawyer Jimmy McGill as he transforms into Walter's scumbag lawyer, Saul Goodman. The story of Jimmy McGill on Better Call Saul is a different kind of story in almost every way. Jimmy's turn toward darkness is less grandiose than Walter's and less linear. Instead of being a presumed icon of decency, Jimmy is constantly fighting an uphill battle to be taken seriously and not assumed to be the scum of the earth. This was true even when Jimmy was a child. Better Call Saul gives the impression that he was always something of a schemer, even as a child working part-time at his dad's local convenience store. Chuck, Michael McKinnon, the older brother that Jimmy idolized, at one point says that Slippin' Jimmy had been conning ever since he was 9, that he couldn't keep his fingers out of the cash drawer, chicanery. While it is never made explicit, it is implied on several occasions that Jimmy's borrowing was instrumental in the eventual closing of his dad's business. For instance, Chuck offhandedly mentions that Jimmy stole as much as $14,000 from the store as a child, Rebecca. The majority of the show follows Jimmy as he tries to make it as a legitimate lawyer in Albuquerque. The general concept of the show focuses on his constant battle with whether or not to take the short and unethical route to success. This is exemplified even in the pilot, which is bookended by Jimmy defending a couple of belligerent teenagers in court and working with a pair of amateur con men to make a quick buck. The first time he caves significantly is midway through the first season when he stages a fake accident in order to look like a hero, thereby gaining sympathy and attracting a client base for his practice, Hero. A similar incident occurs in the front half of the second season when Jimmy manufactures evidence after the fact to get his client off of criminal charges, Cobbler. This behavior is in constant conflict with the standard set by Chuck, who bitterly despises Jimmy and finds him unworthy to practice law, an institution that Chuck holds above all else. Jimmy's taste for cutting corners goes off without a hitch early in the show until he goes up against his brother's firm, HHM. In order to win clients over to his side, he carefully doctors a document to confuse the clients and his brother alike. At first, his plan goes off seamlessly. The clients, Mesa Verde, Bank, leave HHM to work with his best friend Kim Wexler, and Jimmy emerges victorious. Chuck, though, knows something is up. He pursues a rabid investigation, trying to connect Jimmy with the error and eventually getting Jimmy to confess by pretending to have a psychotic breakdown. This confession is the beginning of a dark path for Jimmy. He is forced to defend himself in court directly against Chuck. The trial is long and dirty. By the end of it, two consequences emerge. First, Jimmy is barred from practicing law for an entire year. Second, prodded by Jimmy, Chuck has a complete breakdown and erupts in anger in front of the court, spewing his actual hatred for Jimmy and his status as a lawyer. Jimmy was already aware of Chuck's distaste for him, but here Jimmy receives the full blast of vicious hate from his brother. This completely severs the already strained bond between the two McGill brothers. Since he cannot practice law, Jimmy tries to direct commercials. But when commercial directing is insufficiently profitable, Jimmy stages a series of cons to find extra cash, blackmailing his community service supervisor, staging an accident to get settlement money, and even stooping so low as to manipulate an elderly former client by alienating her from her friends to get her to settle out of court on a case that would net Jimmy some money. While Jimmy eventually has enough remorse to undo most of the damage, he is unable to foresee all of the harm his desperate acts have caused. While trying and failing to obtain a refund on his malpractice insurance, he tips off the insurance agent that Chuck might also need to have his rates increased as a result of his behavior at the trial, expenses. This petty action causes a ripple of events that eventually leads to Chuck being forced into retirement from HHM against his will. Forced retirement on top of Jimmy evading total disbarment finally pushes Chuck over the edge. Jimmy visits him one final time to make amends, only for Chuck to dismiss him, not angrily this time, but condescendingly and without emotion, telling Jimmy that in the end he is bound to hurt everyone around him before walking direct up to him and bluntly stating, "The truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me. Lantern." As Chuck was someone Jimmy spent his entire life looking up to, this final twist of the knife absolutely destroys Jimmy. That pain is only worsened when later in that episode, Chuck succumbs to his distress and commits suicide by burning his house down, making this the last thing he ever said to Jimmy. The preceding season is born out of the trauma that ended Season 3. Jimmy bottles up his grief and pushes on, refusing to deal with his complicated feelings toward Chuck. As a result, Jimmy's moral flexibility is even more pronounced. He starts a side business selling burner phones to the criminal underworld to make some extra cash. Even worse, he starts to rope Kim into his webs of deceit. They partake in a series of con jobs that get more ethically dubious as the season progresses. After getting denied the reinstatement of his law license a year after his disbarment hearing, Jimmy constructs an elaborate narrative to convince the committee that he is sincerely broken up about his brother's death and wants to do everything he can to be worthy of the legacy Chuck left behind. At his appeal hearing, he gets choked up, cries, and convinces the entire courtroom that he is completely and totally sincere. Only once when he is alone with Kim does he break his facade. "Did you see those suckers? That one asshole was crying. I had this energy going through me. It was like improv or jazz, and then boom, I sunk the hook in. Winner." In the conclusion of the fourth, and at the time of this writing most recent season, Jimmy shows that there is no length he will not go to in order to get what he wants and no line he will not cross, including expressing fake grief over his dead brother. Any chance of experiencing real grief disappears at this moment. Everything is now defined by how he can use something to manipulate people for his own selfish ends. This is reinforced in the final moments of the season when he declares that he will no longer practice law as Jimmy McGill, but instead as his conman alter ego, Saul Goodman. He is Jimmy McGill no more. Only Saul Goodman remains. Even though the entirety of Better Call Saul is about Jimmy resisting what he knows to be the easy option and trying to do the right thing, His environment significantly influences the choices he makes and the person he ultimately becomes. This is set in motion even when he was just a child working for his dad. While Chuck continually accused Jimmy of stealing from his father, a flashback in the cold open to the Season 2 episode Inflatable paints the situation with a little more nuance. In this sequence, we watch a con man enter the store and succeed in tricking Jimmy's dad into giving him money. Jimmy sees right through the scam and unsuccessfully tries to talk his dad out of falling for it. While Mr. McGill is in the back, Jimmy confronts the scammer, who offers to buy a pack of cigarettes for Jimmy to pocket the cash. While Jimmy contemplates that proposal, the con man imparts his last wisdom on Jimmy, saying, "There are wolves and sheep in this world, kid. Figure out which one you're gonna be." Inflatable. Jimmy silently answers this question by pocketing the cash as the man leaves. This scene highlights that what is actually in Jimmy's nature is not so much his scheming and lying, but his inherent ability to read people and understand them. When he grows up, Jimmy can sweet-talk anyone and distill how to interact with them down to a science. He does this here when he accurately identifies the con man's plot. It also shows that his first impulse is not to make a profit from the scam himself, but instead to warn his father. It is only after this fails that he decides to cash in on it. Most importantly, he only decides to pocket the cash himself when the con man convinces him to do so. Jimmy internalizes his words and makes the decision then and there to be a wolf. This crucial moment in Jimmy's childhood mimics that of the Bobo doll experiment conducted by Bandura. Jimmy observes the con man steal from his dad as the child watches the scientist attack the Bobo doll. Then, once he is alone, he follows suit and steals from his father like the con man, making the situation function as a textbook example of social learning theory. This watershed moment helped shape Jimmy into the person he will become. He again is defined by irresponsible people in his life who help lead him down a dark path that he could have otherwise avoided. While Better Call Saul does not give many details on the time before the beginning of the show in Albuquerque, the general impression is that Jimmy spent this time clean. He worked in the mailroom at HHM, took law classes at the University of American Samoa, and seemed to keep his head down until he became a lawyer. This is extremely telling because this is the major point in his life where he is surrounded by people who are focused on working hard and getting the job done. It is only once he is out on his own that he encounters shady people that send him back on the con man's path. In the pilot of the show, Jimmy finds himself in the crosshairs of a couple of amateur con men who try to convince him that he has run over one of them with his car. Since he is well acquainted with these schemes, he sees right through their plan. However, since he is also in a bind himself, he enlists them to help him land a client he is trying to secure. This marks the first return to Slippin' Jimmy in years, and one that is instantly filled with complications. While he tries to do things the right way and work hard to get the job done, his first major break into dubious behavior begins when Chuck finally lets Jimmy know how much he really hates him. People don't change. Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun. The realization that Chuck, in fact, loathed him as a lawyer is absolutely devastating. The rest of Jimmy's decisions are born out of the pain that this revelation has on him. In this era of his life, Jimmy's bad choices and scheming ways are the results not of the inclusion of a negative influence, but the removal of a positive one. With Chuck now positioned as the enemy, Jimmy becomes desperate to prove his brother wrong and does everything he can, including cutting corners, to make that happen. This part of Jimmy's life is similar to Pavlov's dog and his theories of classic conditioning, as well as B.F. Skinner's work on operant conditioning. Jimmy is both the dog and the rat in these instances, while Chuck is always the scientist. Every time the bell rings or Jimmy gets the chance to advance in his legal career, Chuck puts him down in a much more perverse form of feeding him a treat, and Jimmy behaves poorly and unethically because it is what Chuck expects him to do. Once Chuck commits suicide, though, Jimmy is no longer fed a treat when a legal opportunity arises, but he still salivates by cutting corners and behaving unethically because Chuck has conditioned him to do so. The same is true with Jimmy as the rat in Skinner's experiment. Jimmy has tried to win Chuck's approval as a lawyer time and time again, always getting punished by Chuck for this. After repeated failed attempts to do so, he recognizes that the path of least resistance is to stop playing the game altogether. The rat in the box found a path in the electrified box to the switch to turn off the power faster each time they were dropped in, and thus Jimmy does the same thing, resorting to criminal behavior more easily as he keeps getting shocked for trying to impress his brother by traditional means. This psychological conditioning is the major fuel behind his decision to tamper with the legal documents in the Mesa Verde case. As expected, this decision sets off the chain of events that dig Jimmy into the proverbial hole he cannot get out of. Chuck records Jimmy's confession on a hidden tape recorder. Jimmy breaks in and destroys it with a private investigator present. He has to defend himself at a disbarment hearing and is suspended from practicing law for a year, all eventually leading both to Chuck's suicide and Jimmy adopting the Saul Goodman persona. So while Jimmy is responsible for the poor and unethical decisions he makes that lead him into eventually becoming Saul Goodman, it is also clear that at every junction of poor decision-making in his life, he was always accompanied by people who sought to bring Jimmy down to their level, whether it be the con man from his childhood or his own brother. Therefore, reducing Jimmy's ultimate transformation as fundamentally part of his nature is to ignore large chunks of his life where he was nurtured, taught, and conditioned to do the wrong thing. As a result, Jimmy's journey to criminality is defined by nurture. In Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill's transformation into Saul Goodman is depicted as inevitable from the first frame, driven by the show's status as a prequel to Breaking Bad. The audience knows Jimmy will become the selfish and insincere Saul Goodman, as his presence in Breaking Bad predetermines his criminal path. This inevitability creates a sense of desolation, as the show offers glimmers of hope for Jimmy's redemption, but ultimately leads to the loss of everything likable about him. Despite this, Better Call Saul subverts the nature versus nurture discussion by showing that Jimmy's criminality is not straightforward. His decline is marked by poor choices and unfortunate circumstances, suggesting that different factors could have prevented his transformation. This fosters a newfound sympathy for Jimmy, humanizing him beyond the sleazy persona seen in Breaking Bad. A poignant moment in the Season 4 finale shows Jimmy weeping alone in his broken-down car, mourning the death of his former self, which elicits audience empathy. The show portrays Jimmy as a nuanced character, akin to a sleazy car salesman losing his humanity, challenging simplistic views of criminality. By focusing on the forces behind Jimmy's descent, Better Call Saul serves as an effective pedagogical tool, offering a complex and accessible exploration of criminal behavior through its subversive take on the nature versus nurture debate.